Welcome, everyone. We're very happy that you've come once again to another seminar in our primary prevention of intimate partner violence. This is a Utah Department of Health grant that we received. This is the second half of our 12-month series. Today, we're doing a follow-up on one of our three goals. 4 speakers today. We're talking about using communication in the primary prevention of intimate partner violence. There's lots of different things that we're going to be talking about today in relation to communication. And we will have about 40 to 45 minute presentation. We're lucky to have Brittany Kyoko Badger Glee. We've also got a pair of speakers, Micah Baker and Raina Berrigan, and they're going to be talking together. They both work together on primary prevention of intimate partner violence. Following up at 5 o'clock to 6, we have Kristen Floyd, who's coming from Safe Harbor. Upcoming symposiums, we have April 27th. We're going to have Dr. Franchek back. We'll be talking about healthy relationships, followed up by our last symposium for the academic year on May 25th, bringing primary prevention all together. We have our 5 primary prevention areas. Today, we're using the use of language and communication. We have no disclosures to declare. The other group that we work with is the University of Utah Gender-Based Violence Consortium. We really like to make sure that everyone is aware of various learning opportunities. Brittany's the director of the Center for Student Wellness at the University of Utah. Her office provides the vast majority of health and wellness education prevention programming, including efforts to reduce and prevent interpersonal violence. Her office is also the home to the free and confidential victim survival advocacy group, which serves students, faculty, and staff who have experienced IPV to seek support, access resources, and identify their own individual path to healing and justice. Brittany is a proud U of U alumni, and she's completed her graduate work in health promotion and education with areas of focus on eating disorder, whiteness representation within local food systems. Prior to her time on campus, Brittany was an adjunct instructor for the College of Health and worked in the Employee Wellness Coordination for Salt Lake County. In addition, she serves as an advisory member of the U's McCluskey Center for Violence Prevention. She co-chairs the Student Affairs Staff Wellness Committee, launched the U's Alcohol and Drug Network, and she was the former co-chair of the Student Affairs Diversity Committee. In her extra time, Brittany and her husband provide empowerment and healing groups to female identified victims of survivors of violence. And she resides in South Georgia with her husband, kids, and their 2 puppies, Fluffy and Max. She enjoys the small things in life, like good coffee and spending more time at home with her family. Brittany, welcome.
Thank you so much for the invitation. It is so great to come and speak with you all today. All right, everyone should see a bunch of superheroes, right? So I was asked to come and speak a little bit today about bystander intervention. And it's an interesting conversation in how within our office, the Center for Student Wellness, how we talk about bystander intervention, especially as it pertains to interpersonal violence or intimate partner violence. I'll speak a little bit more about that. I kind of preface this with kind of an invitation for us to expand the way we talk about intervening in problematic scenarios to really kind of shift that conversation to how do we build a more inclusive and supportive community culture, which definitely takes time. And so that's kind of the essence of what this presentation is today. I always start with this, and I know that we see many land and labor acknowledgements, but I'm sure like many of you, this last week has felt really, really rough. And so I just also want to acknowledge that I'm showing up today feeling pretty vulnerable and a little bit outraged and angry. And so I kind of just want to hold some space for all of us to, just be human and breathe and, show ourselves some grace and show others grace. But I think there's this really important piece to this that, we have to acknowledge that violence is a very unfortunate piece of our history. And, when kind of thinking about trying to talk about how intimate partner violence and bystander intervention, how all these pieces come together, we have to kind of come to terms with, what has been a piece of our past. I won't read this in detail, but we also have this posted on our website within the Center for Student Wellness. And I appreciate Linda giving a little bit of an overview of who I am. I've lived in Utah my whole life. I'm a forever University of Utah alum. I love this community. I love living here. My background is primarily in primary prevention, particularly with health education. So when I kind of think about what do I bring to this work? We all bring different pieces of ourselves to this work. I think that the different things that we have navigated, especially in this last year, have really shifted hopefully our lenses and kind of the way that we view these issues, because it's definitely brought a lot of things to light. Our office with the Center for Student Wellness, we do quite a bit with violence prevention and support for victims and survivors. So we're kind of this very comprehensive space where we are talking about these things from a very upstream approach, as well as, how are we helping to support those individuals who have experienced some really horrific violence on our campus, or in their lives as students, faculty, and staff, as campus community members. I also want to acknowledge, as we kind of talk about these different pieces with intimate partner violence, that this is an issue that hits very close to home for us. These are just 3 women who we have lost, and I know that we all are very familiar with these faces and know that we lost all 3 of them, I think within a academic year, if we kind of like look at the whole spectrum of the year. I would also like for us to acknowledge that there are so many more victims and survivors of intimate partner violence that are not named and whose stories we do not know. We cannot talk about IPV without also talking about power dynamics and oppression and racism, and whose stories we hear about and whose stories we don't. I think that this is something that I've been thinking about a lot, especially over the last week with the shootings in Atlanta. Just to be very frank, the way that conversation has been framed about those women of Asian descent who lost their lives has been maddening. An Asian background, and I can't help but feel so enraged just about how some of that has been discussed. And so I want to make sure that we name that and acknowledge that we, in order for us to fully embrace what we need to do as community members to address this issue from a primary prevention place, like we cannot tease out racism and oppression and power. It is very intimately involved with all of these topics. I will be discussing a little bit about bystander intervention, but I would like for us to view this from beyond, as much as we can, beyond an IPV prevention lens. And I'll talk a little bit more about what I'm talking about there. When we talk about bystander intervention, I was thrilled to hear that Jamie and Linda, their teams, were putting together all of these different things over this last year, focusing very explicitly on primary prevention. I think that we all know that there is such an important need to focus on primary prevention, but when it comes to intimate partner violence, we are so reactive and responsive that sometimes we forget that we also need to be focusing on the prevention piece, or there's not funds, or there's not resources, and there's a lot that plays a role. So I was really excited that they were really focusing on this last year, and that we've been able to be a part of that conversation. When we talk about bystander intervention today, I'm going to encourage us all to also think about how do we shift and kind of broaden our understanding of bystander intervention to more of a primary and secondary intervention lens. I will talk briefly about bias and social norms and just how that is interwoven with how we intervene or when we intervene. I'm going to share just kind of some step-by-step pieces of, here are some things that we can consider as we're trying to build our skills, because, at the end of the day, intervening in problematic situations can feel very scary. It can feel overwhelming. It can feel uncomfortable. There is not really an easy way to get through that other than just to practice. And so I hope to include some really tangible pieces today that we can take home with us so that we can actually start practicing this in our day-to-day life, within the workplace, but also at home, in our community, and just really can figure out how can we do a better job as just a larger community about checking in and holding others accountable. A couple things about what we know, and I'm sure that all of you in this symposium today know this. This is just some data from our University of Utah campus climate survey. So this is specific for students, which is the population that I work with. We launch a campus climate survey every 2 years. Last year, the 2020 iteration concluded right before the pandemic hit and forced the entire university to close. So the data that we have is from the responses from February last year. What I will say, generally speaking from this report, and you can find the full report online if you just search for Campus Climate Survey, University of Utah 2020, you can find it pretty easily. It's public. But what we do know is that most people do not report their experiences of IPV, which I do not think is a surprise to us. We know that it is a very underreported experience. When we asked our students, though, why they didn't report their experience of violence, the top 2 reasons were that they didn't think it was a big deal, or that they believed that nothing would be done. I think that is something that we very much need to pay attention to, that we have a number of individuals, not just students, but people throughout our communities who experience violence. And I know in the state of Utah, we're all very aware that this is an issue that impacts us at higher rates than other states. But most people don't share what happened to them because they don't think anyone's going to believe them, or that it's not going to be considered a big deal, or that there's this kind of this self stigma of, it wasn't a big deal. People experience worse things. I shouldn't bring it up. And so I think that's important for us to this conversation, that we have to figure out, how do we talk about this, because harm is harm. And we'll talk about this spectrum as well. The other piece is that most experiences of IPV are also not this stranger danger element. Most harm is perpetrated by people who are known to our victims and our survivors. It's usually by a former partner or a current partner, pardon my typo, or an acquaintance. So it's someone that they know. It is very rarely someone that they do not know. But yet I think when we think about this idea of IPV, it's usually, and I know that there was a campus alert that went out not too long ago about someone coming out from behind a dumpster. And so those are kind of the images that feel very scary to us. And I think that in order for us to have a very important conversation about IPV, we have to understand that most harm is perpetrated by individuals that we know. And then lastly, is this piece, though, that most people try to intervene when they see something that feels problematic. But what we also know is that the more concerning the situation is, the less likely someone is to intervene. And whether that's, lack of skill or lack of confidence, we'll talk about that. Or if it's after an incident has occurred, so someone shares with an individual after the fact that they were assaulted, that they were raped, there is just this kind of this gray area of like, well, I don't know what to do, or it's already happened. And so we don't think of that as intervention. And so I'm going to kind of talk about all of this in terms of, how do we broaden our spectrum of understanding, and how do we really practice those skills of just checking in with the people in our community. I do open up with this question of, what is a good community member? And, when you think about what that means to you, what does it mean to you to be a good community member? Like, does it mean being engaged? Does it mean knowing how your neighbors are doing or how your colleagues are doing? Does that mean caring about all of that? I want you to think about what it means to be a good community member, because when we're talking about bystander intervention, ultimately what we are talking about is how do we build the skills that we need to check in or to intervene when we see something that's problematic, because we care about our community. And I think sometimes that part is often lost in the conversation when we're talking about bystander intervention. It's kind of usually a very clear cut, like, if you see this, do this. But I want us to think maybe a little bit more with our heart and with our emotions, that, intervening requires this sense of feeling responsible for the people in our lives and the people that live in our community, that we want them to be okay. We want them to be safe. We want them to feel heard. And, what does that mean? So just kind of think a little bit about that as we go through the rest of this today. A couple terms just to very briefly bring up, because when we think about also what it means to be a good community member, there are some elements that kind of they really much change how we view what a community means to us. And so we have to acknowledge that we all have bias, and that bias can play a role in what it means to be a part of a community. I think this is something that we talk about a lot, especially over this last year, about, more and more of our people that are in our actual community coming out and being like, well, I don't feel like I belong here, And so when we talk about this idea of bias, I want you to think about, what it is that comes to your mind when you think about your community, because that's kind of the first step of raising our level of awareness of what it is that we actually think of, and who is missing from our community when we're thinking about that. And then also this piece of social norms. So when we're talking about social norms, it's a really important piece to bystander intervention, because what has become normal in our country, there's a lot of work that we have to do to make that not normal anymore. Because if it's, when we think about kind of the scripts that we adhere to, if it falls in line with what we are thinking is socially acceptable, we are less likely to intervene in something that's problematic, even when we know it is. But if it kind of falls in line with what we know to be a social norm, we are less likely to intervene. So we'll talk more about that too. So a question, this is more of a scenario, and if you would like to add your responses in the chat, or if you would like to unmute yourself, I'd love to hear what your thoughts are. So just a question, so you're walking through the grocery store one afternoon and recognize a former colleague who you haven't talked to in a couple months. They seem to be just staring at one of the shelves, a bit checked out, and as you get closer, it looks like they have been crying. So I want you to just kind of imagine this scenario, and I want you to answer this question of what would you do? Do you keep walking? Do you stop? Does it, even register as something that you think about? And I would love to just hear maybe what your thoughts are either in chat or if you would like to unmute yourself to share just what you think you would do. And there are no right or wrong answers here.
Well, I'll be the first to speak. Surprise. It's interesting because I really feel, I think when I was younger, I might have said, oh, immediately, of course I'm going to stop in. Of course I'm going to stop and check in on that person. But if I'm really honest, I think what I might do is like check my time, check my emotion. And it's like, okay, can I do this? And I think I would always check in on someone, but and I'm just being perfectly honest because I know I should be checking on that person, but I think, acknowledge, how are you? But I think I have the tendency to go deeper in things. And so you're not always able to do that. And so being able to recognize, yes, you can check in on someone, but what is your bandwidth and capacity at that moment? And what are some, kind of trying to keep in mind maybe what I can do if I see something like that, if I'm not able to get engaged fully.
Yeah, those are excellent points. Thanks, Linda. Does anyone else have anything else that they think they might do? And again, no right or wrong answers.
There are some things in the chat. Heather Huber said just to stop and acknowledge them with a friendly greeting, which I think maybe would get them to talk to you if they need. Stop and speak to the person, let them elaborate on the situation if warranted, was from Takora Crew.
Yeah. Excellent. Yeah, we usually use this type of scenario. We kind of call it the gray zone of it's a situation where I think you have some sort of a feeling like something doesn't quite seem off, but I'm not sure if this is the appropriate time or the appropriate place to check in. There's some of us that kind of abide by like, I don't want to make a big deal in public. Maybe I would check in later, or, maybe they just want to be left alone. I would want to be left alone. So there's a lot of nuance with these kind of conversations, which makes this idea of bystander intervention really messy. But that's kind of the, in essence, what we're talking about is, especially when we're talking about, supporting other human beings, it is messy. There is not a clear cut, step by step, do this, and then this will happen. Everyone is different. And so how do we kind of build up some of these skills to maybe, kind of check in on a lower level, or practice a few things to just get a little bit more information. There's not a right or wrong answer with this one. So if you are kind of thinking about like what you would do in that situation, I'm sure that we've all experienced something like this, whether it was at a grocery store and whether it was a colleague or whether it was a student or a friend. You can change out the place and the people, but I think we've all experienced something like this. And I think there's always a moment where we're like, I don't know if I should check in now, but I'm thinking about it. So we're going to just talk about a lot of this because it's messy. So, okay. So I just want to really briefly introduce what we use in our office, just because it helps to give some pretty clear steps about what we're talking about with this idea of bystander intervention. We use what we call the step-up model. And so just to very quickly go through it, the way that we talk about how we intervene in situations that feel problematic, the first step is that we actually have to notice. We have to notice what the problem is. Step two is that we have to interpret it as a problem. So we might notice something, but if we don't interpret it as something problematic, the rest of this is kind of pointless, because if we're not identifying something as a problematic situation, we probably are not going to intervene. From that point, once we interpret something as a problem, getting to that place where we assume responsibility. And then step four is evaluating what your role is. So what can you do? What should you do? What's safe? What's unsafe? We'll talk about some of those pieces as well. And then lastly is actually intervening. And I know that feels like a really lengthy process. I will say that steps 1 through 4, the more that we practice kind of noticing, interpreting, assuming responsibility, and evaluating what your role is, the quicker you are to be able to actually step up and intervene. But steps 1 through 4 are critical to this idea of bystander intervention. So we're going to do a little bit of a deeper dive. So first, this idea of noticing the problem. There are a lot of things I think we all can think about that keeps us from noticing just what's going on. Normally when we're in person, what we do is we have everyone close your eyes and feel free to do this. I know it's very different in Zoom, but just even close your eyes for just a moment. And I want you to think about the things in the space where you are. How many windows are in the room where you're in? You know, how many people are attending this Zoom meeting? What color is my shirt? You know, just the things that are right in front of us all the time, but what keeps us from actually noticing what those things are is a really important thing for us to consider. Because if we don't notice something, even from the get-go, the rest of the step-up model, again, like I said, is very pointless. So we know that we tend to navigate our days, you know, fairly distracted or just engaging in like our own thing, that it makes it difficult for us to be aware of what's going on around us. It doesn't necessarily mean that you shouldn't be paying attention to what's going on like in your own head, or, you know, what you're thinking about, or listening to your music, or any of those things. But I think it is important for us to figure out what that balance is, where we can still be aware. You know, so for example, when I am on campus, you know, where my office is, I tend to have to walk 10 to 15 minutes to go to a number of meetings. And so what I would usually do is I'd have my headphones in, I'd be listening to like a podcast or to my music. But I really started getting in the habit of just putting my phone in my pockets. At least visually, I was trying to look around to see what was going on. But, you know, thinking about just what are the things that keep you distracted. And I know that in a virtual space, it's even trickier. And so just kind of thinking about like what keeps us from actually noticing in the first place. I will say though, that beyond even the things like, you know, being on our phone or, you know, turning our cameras off in Zoom, there are some other elements though to this that keep us from noticing that I think we need to make sure that we acknowledge. And these are things about bias, privileges, institutional oppression, social norms. So, you know, as we're walking across campus, you know, or, you know, walking through our work sites, you know, what kind of biases that we hold that maybe keep us from even noticing something as being a problem in the first place. Just to give an example, I hear this from a colleague of mine, and it always makes me think about this step within bystander intervention. He oversees a kind of a transition summer program for kids coming from high school into college. And the students that he is working with are primarily first generation, primarily are students of color. And without fail, every single time these students come to campus and they're, you know, taking a tour, they're walking around and like getting to know the buildings, without fail, they are stopped either by campus police or by other students asking them why they're there. And so when we talk about this idea of noticing, I want us to be very aware of, you know, what kind of biases or the privileges that we hold that, you know, really dictate what it is that we notice as problematic or off compared to others, and then really challenge that. So just kind of a couple examples, but just something for us to think about. And please stop me if you have any questions along the way. I know that 45 minutes goes by fast, so I have quite a bit I would like to get through today, but always happy to answer questions. So this other piece though of, you know, of noticing problems, we're talking about primary prevention in the symposium, right? And, you know, just very briefly for those who are not familiar with primary, secondary, and tertiary, although I would imagine that everyone in this meeting is, you know, when we're talking about primary prevention, we are talking about that time frame before we see something problematic or concerning even emerging. Secondary prevention is where we maybe see some early signs of concern, and then again, tertiary is kind of after the fact, after something has happened. Most traditional bystander intervention programs teaches us to intervene here when we start seeing signs of concern, but before something really terrible happens. And absolutely, I would encourage us to continue to practice those skills to intervene in those moments so that we can reduce the amount of harm that is being caused to other people. However, I would like us to also consider how we can expand our idea of what it means to intervene and also to maybe change the language from intervention to checking in. Generally speaking, and I know that, since all of you are coming from, clinical health programs or clinical health positions, or at least, kind of the various roles that you may hold, we all understand that the earlier that you can catch something, the easier it is to treat. The same thing is true for the earlier that we can intervene or offer support or check in, the easier it is to reduce harm or to help individuals to get the support they need. So just kind of just some verbiage or some things to think about is, how do we expand our idea of intervention and also change that language to checking in? So, all right, so that was a lot on step number 1. And usually we spend a whole lot more time on there. Step number 2 is interpreting it as a problem. I have 2 images up here that I just want to show. I think this first one, we're all probably looking at it and going, oh, that doesn't seem right. That seems really inappropriate. There's a lot of things we can look at in this picture that doesn't feel right. And then we see something like this, which also looks to be a very problematic situation. And I think that we can understand that both of these scenarios feel problematic, but there are some things that are cause for concern. And I want us to think about, especially when we're talking about things like IPV or other types of harm, how we are taught to intervene. I would argue that situations like the one I'm showing now is kind of the classic, like when we're talking about bystander intervention, especially as it pertains to IPV or sexual assault. The image I think or the scenario that comes to everyone's mind is, it's a college party. There is an intoxicated, typically it's an intoxicated white woman who is being cornered by, probably an equally intoxicated white male, and they are about to go up the stairs. And that has historically been the situation that we pose of like, well, how do you intervene? I think that all of us recognize that this is really problematic, and there are a number of things that we can do. And I would also wonder what it is that we learn about how do we intervene in something like this. There's a little bit more of like, well, I'm not sure if I should say something out loud. I don't want to bring attention to it. It does feel problematic, but it doesn't feel as harmful as something like this. And that's like kind of a sweeping judgment, but I think like generally speaking, like when we're talking about bystander intervention, like this is kind of how we talk about it. Both are harmful, right? So just kind of skipping ahead really quickly because I want to launch a poll really quick. And I believe, Jamie, you're helping me with this, if that's correct. So there is an element to this when we talk about interpreting something as problematic, really determines whether we intervene. And so there's a theory, the theory of planned behavior on a very simplistic level. What it tells us is that we can predict whether or not someone would intervene in a problematic situation if a couple things happen. One, if they determine that situation to be problematic, meaning that it falls kind of outside of what we consider to be a social norm. And 2, if we have the skills that we feel confident enough to employ in that moment to intervene. If neither of those things are present, we won't intervene. So I want us to think about this idea, especially about, we can do a lot of skill building, which is very important. But this first piece of, do we even perceive the situation as problematic? We have to talk about social norms with that and what we actually consider to be harmful. So I have a poll, I believe, that Jamie will help me launch. And it's just a series of questions that I want you to just answer in thinking about how severe, like how harmful do these different things feel to you. Again, there are no right or wrong answers, but I would like for you to just answer how problematic each of these different pieces feel to you, whether that's, not problematic to highly problematic. So yeah, so this first one, telling a rape joke, how harmful does that feel to you? And I think that we can all acknowledge that like all of the things that we're about to show are harmful, but kind of thinking about this like spectrum of harm. So this is sexual assault by an acquaintance, sexual assault by a stranger, using alcohol to loosen up a partner, whistling at a woman walking down the street, telling a man he throws like a girl. And I also have to acknowledge like these are very gendered. I should have prefaced this earlier that like when we're talking about IPV, I hope that we're also on the same page that, talking about this in the binary. I'm using a lot of that for this presentation, but that we also know that individuals who identify as BIPOC, or individuals with disabilities, holds a marginalized identity or experience this at higher levels. Joking about how a woman just needs to know her place. Blaming a woman for being assaulted because she made bad choices. So those were just kind of a few examples of types of harm. I would imagine that all of us, as we were kind of thinking through like how harmful are these things, we kind of had to go through this like mental like process, this like Rolodex of like, have I experienced this? Do I know people have experienced this? What are my personal beliefs about this? Again, there's not really wrong or right answers to this, but what I'm hoping that we can get from this is that when we're talking about harm, especially when we're talking about IPV, there is a spectrum here. We are very quick to understand that, sexual assault is a very problematic thing, and, intervening in those situations, please, if you are able to, and if you're present, please do. If you hear someone, catcalling someone on the street or like making a rape joke, do you feel comfortable intervening then? I would argue that we feel less comfortable intervening in those more like gray, like lower harm, quote unquote, situations than we do in those moments where we were like, this is absolutely not okay. This falls outside of what is a social norm. I must intervene, versus something that is very normalized in our culture, which is, highly rooted in like gender dynamics and power, that like making these kind of comments, like we've almost kind of been socialized to like let it go, and how do we kind of shift the conversation to also be not okay with those things as well? Because when we're thinking about true primary prevention, our intention is that we are intervening before something has caused harm to someone, or before someone would need to go in for support or treatment. And that requires us to really shift our perspective of what we're talking about when we're talking about intimate partner violence, and what kind of all these pieces are with harm. Okay, so I spent a lot of time on 1 and 2 for a reason, because if we do not notice something as a problem, and if we don't interpret something as a problem, assuming responsibility and stepping in, like none of that is going to even be on our radar. We will kind of give it a pass. We'll keep on walking. We won't say anything. So 3, 4, and 5 are a little quicker. So when we talk, once we've noticed something, interpret it as a problem, assuming responsibility is kind of this piece where, we have to make that decision that we have to do something, that it's our responsibility, it's something that we should do. So another scenario for you all. You are in a meeting discussing a new project within your department, and during a critical point, you begin to notice that one of your colleagues is continually interrupted by another person in the meeting, and their ideas are quickly dismissed. There is a power dynamic both in position and identity. What do you do? I will just like throw out there that I have been a part of this scenario is based in reality for me. I have lost count how many times I've been in a meeting or been a part of some sort of like a project group where this happens. And I personally am consistently challenging myself of like, how do I intervene in this? Like, this feels so wrong and I'm not sure what to do. And it's very, very difficult, especially when we're talking about this spectrum of harm. But a couple of things that maybe can help guide us is to think about, what would you want? If you were that person being continually interrupted, what would you want? Would you want someone to say something? And I will be the first one to say there are moments in meetings where I'm like, I wish that someone would just say something, because I am just tired and exhausted of trying to state my ideas. Like, I'm just tired of trying to like hold space in this meeting when I keep getting interrupted. And then there are other moments, like if I'm like the only woman in a meeting, or like the only person of color in a meeting, I actually feel uncomfortable if someone was to call that out, because then it feels like it's shining a spotlight on me, and then it makes it even more uncomfortable. And so just kind of thinking a little bit, like there's some nuance here, like what would you want? But to also think like, what happens if you don't intervene? Like, if you don't say anything, what is the harm and what is the cost if you don't? If you don't say something, then who? Like, would anyone else step in? And then also this piece of, should you call in or call out? And just very briefly, what I'm talking about here is, sometimes in meetings like what I just described, what I've noticed something that I actually would prefer to do more of what I call calling in, where maybe it's sending a private email to that individual after the fact, either the person who kept being interrupted and being like, hey, like I noticed in that meeting that you kept getting interrupted, and I'm so sorry. I feel like I should have said something, but I didn't know what to do. But I just want you to know that I acknowledge that, and it feels really yucky. Or to call in the person who kept interrupting and, you know, say, hey, private email. I don't know if this was your intention, but in that last meeting, I had noticed that, you know, so and so was trying to make, you know, some comments and they kept getting interrupted. I don't think it was your intention to cut them off, but the impact of it was pretty heavy and just wanted you to be aware. That's an example of calling in versus calling out is kind of more of that like cancel culture, like in the middle of the meeting, like let the woman speak, which someone has done that in a meeting before that I've been in, and it has felt even more uncomfortable. So kind of making that determination of like calling in or calling out. There are times when you might use one or the other. And so again, this messiness of bystander intervention is really important for us to think about, because we're talking about human beings and we're talking about experiences and identity. So, and then step number 4 is evaluating your role. Obviously, we have some limitations. Sometimes it's dependent on our relationship with that person. There are moments when maybe we don't feel like we have the skills to safely intervene, and that's okay. Like we want to make sure that you are, you know, setting your own personal boundaries and that you're keeping yourself safe. There might be times where I have not felt comfortable intervening in spaces because of my identity. And so it changes the way that I might check in with someone or intervene later on because of all of this. So just knowing that it's important for you to evaluate, like, what is your role, what is not your role, what is your comfort level. Which also,
I was sorry, Brittany, I was going to interrupt. Somebody did make a comment that
yes.
this has happened. She says that it happens a lot with her husband, a retired law enforcement who is an expert in verbal judo. When he talks over someone, I wait for him to finish his thought, then ask the person interrupted to continue with what they were saying. And I was thinking about when you were saying whether you just jump in right then and kind of make more of a mess of the mess, you know, that sometimes, like you said, can do more harm. But I like this idea of just, you know, if you have an equal level of power as the person who's overwhelming people, then you be the one to make sure that you're allowing other voices in.
Yeah, that is an excellent suggestion. I really like that one. I've seen it used in meetings before, and it is a very, I think that especially, yeah, if you are someone who holds some power in that meeting and you notice these things going on, you've interpreted it as a problem, assuming responsibility, that piece of that, I think that is an excellent approach, you know, where it's, and then maybe it requires a conversation after the fact if that's something that feels comfortable with the individual who kept interrupting. You know, but yeah, I really thank you. I did not see the name of the person that shared that, but thank you for sharing that. I think that's a really helpful thing for us to consider and to
Kat.
utilize. Kat,
Good.
thank you.
Yeah.
Great. Love it. So yeah, so kind of just this piece of like knowing when helping can be harmful. You know, I think all of this kind of leads in, like, you do not have to be the hero, the judge, the decider, the investigator, always, or ever sometimes. But what you can do as someone who would, you know, like to practice some of these skills is that you can be someone who is supporting another person. You can listen, you can refer to other resources or to help, you can check in. And something that I always like to include is that you can ask, you know, you can ask that individual, like, I see this, it doesn't feel right. Is there, you know, what can I do that feels comfortable to you or that I can help with? Because I would like to do something, but I'm not sure what that is. And asking what that person might need or would like for you to do. Because sometimes it might be like, yeah, can you say something? Like, I do not have the bandwidth. And I will say that I've done that in certain meetings, if there's other colleagues of mine that are in the same room, sometimes I will send a private text or a chat of like, you know, hey, this feels really problematic. Do you want to say something? Or I'm happy to. And, you know, so you can kind of tag team a little bit. So, and then last piece, this step up and check in. I'm going to go through this pretty quickly. But, you know, this stepping up and checking in, there are a few different approaches that I just kind of want to leave us with to consider, because again, there is no right or wrong answers here. We utilize what we call the 5 Ds. You know, just alliteration is helpful. And so a couple ideas for you as you're thinking about how you can maybe start practicing these type of things in your, you know, daily life. You know, these are things that we should be practicing at work, at home, you know, with strangers, in our community circles, wherever. We can always be practicing this. So the first one we talked about is discuss, and this is really like a truly primary prevention piece of, if you know that you're going somewhere that, might be, there could be the potential for something problematic, to make a plan beforehand, to try to minimize what kind of, what that experience could be for you. Like something we use with students a lot is we'll say things like, yeah, like, if you're planning to go to a party and you know that they tend to get out of hand, maybe chat with your housemates about, hey, I just want to go for a little bit. Why don't we lift home together at 11? It is far easier to have that plan set in stone when you are sober and at home than you are in the middle of a party trying to get everyone to leave at the same time. So, and the same thing too, like if you're going somewhere that there's someone there that makes you uncomfortable or that you would prefer not to be around, it's kind of the same idea of, maybe asking for someone that you're going with, hey, there's someone that's going to be at this gathering that I don't feel very comfortable with, can we make a plan of, how I can exit if things just feel really uncomfortable or unsafe, or can we just maybe do something different? There's a lot of things that we can do with this first D with discuss. The next one is direct, and I think this is more of the, are you okay? Other things that you can say that we, just so you have a few ideas in your pocket, are things like, I believe you, you are so brave for telling me, I'm sorry this happened to you, how can I help you? Do you have a safe place to be? This is not your fault. Zipping through the bottom, please don't ever say you should do X, Y, and Z. The other D that we talk about is distract. This is a fun one that, especially in situations that might cause someone to feel very unsafe or that they're just not very confident in intervening in those moments, can be something like, if you see two people who are arguing or two individuals that the situation feels uncomfortable. And we've seen like a number of like YouTube videos pop up where, there is someone being harassed on like a subway station, and another woman comes up to that person and just starts talking to her about like, hey, I missed you. Where were you at the other day? I thought we were meeting up for coffee. That's distraction and can be a very, very helpful tool. So there's a video that we show in non-COVID times, their students, and I can't remember what the video is titled, but there's an argument going on a subway. A gentleman like actually goes and tries to punch another rider, and this really large gentleman just comes and literally just walks in between the two, eating a bag of chips, and just stands there, doesn't say a thing, but like literally places his body as a distraction between the two, and the fight diminishes. I have heard that the chip company, that whatever he was eating, has offered that. And that student was, or that individual in the train was like a collegiate wrestler, so he could have done something more aggressive, but what he chose was just to distract by just intervening in the middle. And the chip company, I've heard, has given him like a lifetime. And then this other one, I really like this one. I think it is a really important piece, especially if we're thinking about like our relationship with people or the identities that we hold. There are just some things that they come and land differently when it's coming from someone else. Like you may not be the right messenger. And so if you're like seeing something problematic and you don't feel comfortable, or you don't think you're the right person to call that person out or call that person in, you can recruit, you can delegate. I have done this so many times. I can think of 3 times just this week that I have done this already. And it's just kind of taking into account like our identity and the roles that we hold. So, and then always delayed is an option. So if you miss those opportunities to check in with someone, it is okay. It is better to check in with someone afterwards than not at all. If you see something that feels uncomfortable or problematic and you feel like you maybe missed that moment, it is okay to maybe send a message later of, hey, I couldn't help but notice, that you just seemed really like checked out or, a little bit removed yesterday in the meeting. I just want to check in on you and just let you know that I'm here if you want to talk. And so just this last piece of like shifting and reframing, kind of like broadening this idea of what we're talking about with bystander intervention. And I like the idea of just talking about like normalizing regular check-ins. So I encourage you to think about the people in your life, especially right now. The world is feeling really funky right now. And I know that we're kind of, there's some light at the end of the tunnel with this pandemic. And there's also a lot of pain and healing that needs to occur, or a lot of healing that needs to occur and a lot of pain that people are feeling right now for a lot of different reasons. And so I just encourage you to think about the people in your life and think about how could you maybe practice some of these skills to just check in with those in your life. Looking at harm also as a spectrum and kind of thinking about the things that we know absolutely are problematic. Yes, we need to practice continually to intervene in those moments, but how do we kind of broaden this idea of harm and practice intervening at much earlier time points. It's a challenge and it takes practice. And then again, this idea of calling in versus calling out. And then really at the root of all of this, like when we're talking especially about IPV, there is a lot of power and oppression dynamics there that we have to figure out how do we dismantle these systems that are bigger than each of us on our own. We have to figure out how do we come together to really just dismantle that and rebuild something that's better. And so I just encourage you all to practice, reflect, share this info with other people. And with that, I think I am done. And I know there's just a couple minutes for questions, but thank you all for coming today. I hope that there were a couple nuggets in here that felt valuable that you can use in your daily life. You can find me. I'm at the U. Please reach out if you have questions.
Awesome, Brittany. That was really useful. I think you really brought in a whole different perspective with the bystander prevention being a primary prevention. I like the way you went through the different levels of prevention, and we don't really often think about it, you know, being an intervener and listening, and when you hear things, saying something. We've talked a lot about preventative measures and using communication when dealing with patients. I think even if we all take that as a bystander intervention of like, let's reflect on that conversation and ask a question and maybe reroute, be an example. Thank you, Brittany.
Yeah, thank you for the invitation. It was really great to hang out with you all today.